Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today here in the room and online as we discuss the role of technology and estate planning in reducing heirs' property risks. As you will hear, having a formal will or estate plan is an important tool to reduce the risk of heirs' property, which we're going to learn all about, which happens when a home is passed down without a clear and legal title. Estate planning can help preserve wealth between generations, particularly when that wealth is tied to real estate. And as the technology and legal industries increasingly digitalize, it's critical to develop partnerships that ensure that new innovation reaches those most in need. In a brand new report that's called Tangled Titles, Estate Planning and the Digital Divide by urban authors Michael Neal, John Walsh, Matthew Pruitt, and Emily Zinn, we document how technology adoption in the legal industry could help estate planning services reach those most in need. It just went live, so you can find it on the event site, or if you're in the room, via the QR code that's on your table. So tonight, you will hear from 15 of the leading minds in this space: researchers, policymakers, practitioners. Our event includes a fireside chat, multiple speeches, 2 panels, one on research on estate planning and wealth preservation, and another on recent innovations to expand access to estate planning services. And then we'll end the event with a message from Houston City Council member Tiffany Thomas, who will outline local policy strategies to address this issue. Before we begin, I need to go through some housekeeping notes. First, today's event is hybrid. We are thrilled to have attendees with us in person and online. The event is being recorded as well, so these recordings will be posted online on the Urban Institute webpage in the coming days, and we encourage you to share that when it's live. You'll be able to find all the biographies for today's amazing lineup of speakers on the event webpage. And also, live captions are enabled for virtual attendees. You're welcome to turn them off if you would prefer not to have them on during the event. Questions can be submitted virtually using the form shared in the chat. And those of you in the room, again, can use the QR code on your table tents. Another note I want to make is that this is a long event, so I encourage you to get up and take care of your needs. There's some snacks out there, water, as you need during the program. I also want to take a moment to thank JP Morgan Chase, who has been a thought leader on this topic and who is supporting tonight's event and the Urban Report released today. These efforts are part of a broader collaboration between the Urban Institute and JP Morgan Chase over the past 10+ years. That collaboration has supported urban scholars in leveraging research, data, and analysis to inform policy and practice, and we're deeply grateful for their partnership. Housing has been a core focus of our work together, and on the topic of heirs property in particular, it has been fantastic to collaborate with the folks at JP Morgan Chase. They are a leading voice on challenges and solutions in the field, and committing philanthropic data, business engagement, and thought leadership to advance this policy space. I'm delighted that we're joined tonight by 2 leaders from JP Morgan Chase who can speak more about the many ways they are moving the needle on this issue. It's my pleasure now to introduce one of them, Joanna Trotter, who is Executive Director and Senior Program Officer for Global Philanthropy. Joanna oversees the alignment of JP Morgan Chase's national and local strategy for neighborhood development and housing, as well as its grant-making efforts, and I am so glad she's here to lend her perspective and help us frame up the evening ahead. Please join me in welcoming Joanna to the stage.
Thank you so much. All right, want to make sure my mic is working. Sounds like it is. So good evening, everyone, both here in the room and online. It's such an honor to be here with you tonight. Again, my name is Joanna Trotter. I want to thank Yannicka, I want to thank Michael Neal, I want to thank the entire Urban team for continuing to shed light on the issue, the prevalence, and the solutions of heirs property in this country. At JP Morgan Chase, we recognize that a strong economy starts in the communities where people live. Safe and affordable housing anchors families, it supports wealth building, and it fuels local economic growth. Therefore, we're committed to helping more people access the benefits of homeownership and overcome the barriers that stand in the way of building wealth. So heirs property is a significant barrier. The scenario occurs, as Yannicka said, when a homeowner dies without a will or a valid estate plan, and their property is then informally inherited by descendants. And we're seeing situations where this happens in perpetuity through families, through generations. So we can have family and property in the family that has been handed down through multiple generations. So you could have hundreds of heirs, some that know they own shares in the property, some that don't. So this all too often leads to legal challenges or forced sales that strip families of the equity built in their homes, thus creating a major barrier to preserving homeownership and generational wealth building. These consequences are felt by families in urban communities, in rural communities, and it disproportionately impacts low wealth and low income families and property owners. It's estimated in the United States that there are over 444,000 heirs property parcels. So it's really surprising why it's such a quiet but prevalent issue. And so it's so important that we continue to elevate this, that this isn't a unique single property owner issue that we're all sort of grappling with quietly, but that is a prevalent issue that's impacting communities across the United States. These properties total 9 million acres and are valued at over $41 billion. At JPMorgan Chase, we're focused on increasing awareness about this by advancing research, like what we're talking about tonight. Thank you again to Urban. Evidence-based policy recommendations, so we support policies like the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, or UHPA, that provides critical due process protections for heirs property owners, and that's now adopted in 21 states. We hope that continues to grow. We've released policy briefs, including looking at the intersection of heirs property and disaster recovery. We're seeing that acutely in places like Altadena in Los Angeles after the devastating 2025 fires, where you have folks with tangled title that can't get access to FEMA resources or traditional financing to rebuild their homes. And through philanthropic investments, we're funding additional research. We're looking to drive structural solutions, and we're proud to support community-based efforts, that are offering legal and other services to individuals to resolve and prevent heirs property challenges. So ultimately, the insight and innovation in this work is most clearly seen in efforts at the local level. And for that reason, and I'm looking for Christopher, is he in the room? Okay. I'm very excited to introduce Christopher Smith, who's the Senior Community Development Program Officer at the local initiative. Look how perfectly timed that is. The local initiative Support Corporation Jacksonville, to talk about the work that they are doing in Jacksonville, Florida. Welcome, Christopher.
Hey, thank you.
So well timed. All right. So List Jacksonville has been at the forefront of this issue. They've done a lot to even educate us and got us engaged in this work, starting with our local philanthropic team in Florida and going all the way up to our national team. List has a three-pronged approach to heirs. It's to find, it's to preserve, and it's to support those homeowners and property owners in their community. So Christopher, can we just start with you talking a bit more about your model and what you've learned over the last 5 years?
Boy, sure. It's a pleasure to be here with y'all. I want to first acknowledge all of the work that's been done prior to these times, right? So there's been a lot of organizing around Black farmers and others in the Deep South to recognize the importance of this issue. I feel like we're trying to build on the backs of that work and amplify it in a way. So find, preserve, and support is not original. It's the accumulation of some of the best work we've seen around the country. So I'll take each one quickly. Find, we've needed to get more precise about where likely at-risk heirs properties and likely existing heirs properties are. So we've taken the Gretzky approach. Don't go where the puck is. We want to skate to where it's going next, right? So creating some kind of a data platform that can help you understand, not necessarily to predict, but to identify and give some direction as to where these households may be is critically important. It helped us get more targeted in our ability to do outreach. And the other thing it helped us with was understand what messaging would be best served for a particular demographic. So in a neighborhood with older, more mature households, leading with legacy instead of wills or estate planning has been very helpful. Preserve. Well, that gets to the heart of the matter. How do we provide a bridge between folks that understand the importance of the issue and the resources that are available? And so one of the things we've learned along the way is storytelling is critically important. Narrative and story. People are making decisions based on emotion. So what we needed to be able to do is understand who are the credible, trusted messengers in community that could best convey the opportunity that these resources provide. Lastly, I would mention the importance of support is an interlocking play. This issue is layered, and so you've got legal supports necessary. We've had great partnership with our local legal aid office, but we've also worked with our housing counseling agencies. We've worked with local government, and we've worked with philanthropy to help identify non-extractive financial tools such as tax relief that can help folks make good decisions even in the midst of a challenging moment.
Yeah. And what's interesting is like heirs is a universal issue, but it's very nuanced by community.
Yeah.
So as you reflect on lessons learned, we know the approach in different communities has to be different, but what do you see as common themes that can help with replication in terms of what you're doing?
I would say first is the importance of having a shared understanding across sectors in your community of the challenge. And so early on, bringing folks together around a table and understanding the challenge, the implications, and the opportunity for folks to see themselves play a role in the solution. Okay? So that was critically important for us. Next was around understanding how we can help change the narrative. If you go online and type in heirs property and pick your municipality, the likelihood is you're going to see horror stories of people having some form of loss. Mm-hmm. And what we wanted to do and what we've learned is the importance of storytelling and narrative in helping change the way people understand the possibilities. And when people can see themselves being able to have autonomy, then folks are willing to take risk. I think the last thing I'd say about it is we saw the importance of addressing the friction in the process. And so one of the things we needed to do early on was listen loudly and have folks share what has been their experience, lived or otherwise, whether they've heard stories from other family members and could share what that experience was like, what were the road bumps, and how might we alleviate those. Frankly, eliminating friction was more important than money because it helped build confidence and it helped people feel like they could trust a system that may or may not have done right by them in the past.
I think it's interesting thinking about that lived experience both directly and indirectly because the numbers that I shared earlier don't account for all the property that's already been lost, right? And so there is a generational knowledge around this issue that we need to bring to the fore. I talked a little bit earlier about even issues with disaster and access to capital. But that doesn't account for just the regular access to capital that most homeowners can do any day, right? Using their equity to replace the roof or to refinance or to pay for kids' college. So have you seen any promising practices when it comes to new product solutions for heirs issues?
Yes, I mean, certainly the FEMA rule change has helped, but that's been at the federal level.
So say more about that.
So that is essentially FEMA has created opportunities for families who find themselves with tangled title to provide alternative proof of ownership so that they can still be eligible for potential housing assistance. What we need to now think about is bringing that down, funnel that down to the state and local level. How might we allow and enable folks who are in a tangled title scenario still be eligible for housing assistance under certain conditions, like they are They are living in the home for a period of time. They are paying the taxes. They are paying the utility bill. But Texas has looked at this, and Professor Heather Way has done some terrific work around that. So I'd say eligibility, proof of ownership eligibility is one area of focus. Another, frankly, is coming up with different ways in which we can underwrite fractional ownership. And so we're testing a fractional share loan product as we speak to try to understand what that underwriting criteria might look like for folks even when they don't own 100% ownership of the house. So I think those two. The last I'd say, you mentioned disasters. We're testing this idea of providing a line of credit for pre-registered heirs households. So back in June, we conducted some door knocking of folks that we thought were likely heirs households, created a registry that now we are able to now provide through a local partner a line of credit for immediate use in a post-disaster scenario. Now it's limited, right? It's up to a particular amount, but it helps with immediate basic needs while the family might be sorting out their ability to recover from a disaster.
So the next panel is going to talk about data and technology. So you talked a little bit about how you're already using data. I'm curious if you have other thoughts as, again, we think about replication and scale of what are the opportunities to use data and what are some of the barriers in terms of access.
Well, barriers are skepticism, and rightly so, and perhaps the biases that get repeated in algorithms that are used. So it's about understanding where there may be a need for audit type efforts to look at algorithms that are being used and understand, are they delivering the right outcome, and not creating a reoccurrence of particular bias, right? So for us, we're looking at the idea, I'll use the analogy of a pancake. We're creating, and have created, a proprietary algorithm that harmonizes public data sets, all right? So ownership data, demographic data, voter registration data, public data sets, bring them all into one platform, and then create a profile or a understanding of a particular neighborhood. That's helped us understand whether or not the interventions we have are sufficient to address the particular neighborhood market condition. And so we're looking for ways to use data to drive a market neighborhood tipping strategy. How many households are at a level of distress that we can intervene to assist to help tip that neighborhood away from speculative capture and towards generational wealth?
And you talked a little bit when we were just preparing too, of just the use of technology to go deeper versus wide, right? Like how does it enable your work in other communities to go deeper? You're talking about targeting, so I got that part. Anything else?
Well, it speaks to when we started, we thought there's a number we got to hit. We got to do a certain number of cases, we got to hit. And what we realized, at least in our market, is that it's more important to focus on concentration and prioritize neighborhoods that, if there is no intervention, may not be able to recover. And so it's helping us create a better diagnosis of what is happening in community in real time, and then designing the right, perhaps, prescription or intervention that may actually speed up the recovery of that neighborhood. And I know that's loose, sort of jargony talk, but the point is, it's about us being better and more data-driven in how we understand the nature of the challenge and the conditions that folks are finding themselves in, and then designing for that said challenge.
So in our last 2 minutes,
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a bit about how LISC is now taking what you've done in Jacksonville and starting to think about other markets that LISC operates in.
Yeah, so we try to create something like an innovation hub where we can quickly prototype and pilot test ideas in Jacksonville that potentially are scalable. And we can learn faster that way, right? And so the idea is with messaging, now we can test an idea of, or message like keep the home and the family in 8 different markets all at once and determine what sticks in what market and then build around that, okay? So our idea is that we believe that there are neighborhoods, particularly legacy neighborhoods, that with the right intervention can be tipped towards stabilization, right? And we're looking for cues that give us a sense of where those neighborhoods may be. For example, Joanna, think about the rail network that runs through our country. And what we found in Jacksonville is that legacy neighborhoods have 2.5 times likely heirs concentration when they are a quarter of a mile near a railroad, particularly a freight line use. And so that directionally sent us into some neighborhoods, but for that data we hadn't thought of. But it now connects us to other places where we know migration patterns can tie in. So Jacksonville, as a young man, I always thought about going to Atlanta because it was seen as the place to go if you wanted to be economically prosperous, right? Well, there's a migration pattern between Jacksonville and Atlanta, and part of that migration was partly through the rail lines. So we could look at it and say, people who lived in Jacksonville for a long time may have left, moved to Atlanta. Now they may have property still in Jacksonville, and we can now build some kind of peer learning amongst LISC networks to help share ideas that we think can stick.
Well, I want to just thank you for tonight. I want to thank you for your work, and I want to thank you for blazing the trail for other communities who want to address this issue. So thank you for all of your work on that. Our next panel will focus on, first of all, can we all clap?
Thank you.
Started moving on. Thank you, Christopher. So the next panel is going to look at data and research on importance of wills and estate planning for wealth preservation. I want to introduce the moderator, Tobias Salinger. He's the chief correspondent for financial planning. So welcome to the stage. Is he coming on? Okay, all right. Thank you all.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tobias Salinger. I'm the chief correspondent at Financial Planning. We're an industry news outlet for financial advisors and other wealth management professionals, and it's a huge honor to share the stage with some of the leading researchers and experts and practitioners around heirs property. So why don't we just dive right in? I'll start right to my left, JP Aubrey of the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College. If you could just tee up this discussion for us. We're talking about real estate wealth, and we know that that can be at risk when the property owner is getting close to death. So why are tangled titles such an important big issue?
Right. Thank you for that introduction, Tobias. Really happy to be here to talk about this. We, at the center, it's in our name, retirement research, right? So we come at this from an angle of retirement wealth and the importance of building wealth to pass on to the next generation, to finance expenses in retirement. And so when we think about tangled title, we think about the house, and we think about wills. I just want to give you some quick statistics when just thinking about transfers of wealth generally, and I'll talk a little bit about what the reason the house plays such an important role in that process. So in the mid-90s, will writing was around 70% in America. So about 70% of households had a will or trust. Today, that number is down to 60, and the trend seems to be continuing. Non-white households in particular are 20% less likely to have a will than white households. So it's a more serious issue among non-white households. Now, this matters for a couple of reasons. So first, non-white households are 20 to 25% less likely to receive an inheritance. Right? So we're talking about generational wealth transfer, housing, other assets. They're already behind white households in the United States. They're 50% less likely to receive inheritance of at least $100,000. They're also, this creates a generational effect because black households, non-white households, they're 5 to 7% less likely to plan to leave assets. But if they received an inheritance, they're 10% more likely to plan to leave inheritance, right? So there is a kind of a generational aspect to this, that it's learned behavior. If you received an inheritance, you may think about leaving inheritance for your kids. If you didn't, it may not be the way you think about generational transfers. So to the extent that that can be improved, that first generation that leaves wealth, that starts a snowball effect, right? And importantly, Black and Hispanic families, they are also much more likely, not much more likely, let's say 5 to 10% more likely to not leave the amount that they want to. So even for those that plan to, they don't leave as much as they'd like to. Again, wills reverse that, right? So those with wills are actually 7% more likely to meet their goals, right? So in terms of transferring wealth in general, we think about wills as a first issue, and that's an important part. It's associated with transferring wealth, with transferring the amount of wealth that you plan to leave, with helping next generations think about transferring wealth. All right, so we think of that as the first step. But when we're talking about what you're leaving, it depends on what kind of asset, right? Houses are very different from dollars, right? And what you can do with them, how you can liquidate them, how you can parse them out among family members, right? There's also, unsurprisingly, a racial gap in the United States for a racial difference, I should say gap, a difference in the United States. For non-white households, the house is 80 to 85% of all their wealth on average. So that's most of what they're passing along. For white households, it's more like 50 to 60. So it's a very different transfer process, right? Very different type of assets that may be being transferred for non-white households and white households in the United States. And one thing we think about when you talk about tangled title in particular, how much that impacts black households. If the house is what you have, right, and you can't pass that along, the chain stops there, right? And so we're interested in understanding tangled title. We're also interested in understanding what it means to have joint ownership. That is you know, it's a challenge. We have a huge wealth transfer coming in the United States for Black and white families. You know, with the baby boom, where housing will be a big component for everybody. It will often be passed to 2, maybe 3 kids. And what does it mean to have joint ownership of an asset that is not liquid, not separable, not easily monetized? How do you organize around that? Set it up such that it can create value for the family. And this is particularly important, again, for non-white families, where that is probably going to be the primary asset for many families. And so that's, from our perspective, why tangled title is so important.
Well, that's great. And just for the audience, if you have questions, please feel free to enter them. If you're at home watching, please type it in. I can pose it toward the end of the panel, but now I want to turn to Karama Neal, a consultant in name, in trade, but a collaborator in practice as a policymaker, as someone who has experienced this firsthand, as an expert researcher known around the country, for understanding this issue of heirs property. We just talked about the importance of a will, but as you have told me, sometimes a will is not enough, oftentimes. In fact, why is that a misunderstanding and a mistaken assumption around this topic of heirs property and tangled titles?
Thank you so much for a really kind introduction. Really pleased to be here among this panel and really excited to have this conversation. So I appreciate the way you framed that question, particularly around misunderstandings. And as you noted, my family has heirs property, so this is personal for me. When I think about this work, and I think about my great-great-grandfather who bought his property in the 1800s, he asked, and he was told at that time, the story goes, obviously I wasn't there, that if he wanted to leave his property to his family, he needed to die without a will, right? Obviously, that was poor legal guidance, right? I don't know that one could have expected much more in terms of good legal guidance at that time period, given who he was. But that was the guidance he had. Today, we still have issues around education and making sure these things that people understand the importance of a will and how it can operate. I'd like to start, we heard Christopher Smith talk earlier about narrative, and I'd like to start with a really quick story, which helps to me really, it's what made me understand why wills may not always be quite enough. I volunteered in wills clinics for a number of years. The organization I worked for at that point would host them. And I'm not an attorney, so my favorite role was, some of these folks have heard this story before, my favorite role was to serve as a witness. And I took that very seriously, right? Is this person look like they know what they're doing? Do they look like, are there tons of people around coercing them? So I took it very seriously. And so I would witness, and we'd sign our name and write our, have the name printed out that we had signed that. And so I did that for a number of years, moved on, did other things. Last summer, I get a call out of the blue, no longer working for this organization. And the woman says, "Is this Karama Neal?" I said, "Yes, it is." She said, "Your name is on my mother's will." And I said, "Who is your mother?" Right? I had no idea. It's completely out of the blue. It turns out after conversation, it was clearly just someone whose will I had witnessed, right? The woman had a will in her hand. She said, "I have this paper, I have this will. My mom died in 2021, this is now 2024, and I'm not sure what to do with it," right? And so I was, thankfully, she had to look me up because my number and email address wasn't on the form, so she Googled me. She's looking for assistance, trying to figure out what to do with this will, right? So that story to me brings up a number of things. One, it makes me recognize that wills, you have to know what to do with the will, right? You have to make sure not only that you know what to do, that your heirs, your executors know what to do, that they have the money to deal with it. Wills can be costly to probate. It can be costly to hire an attorney. That was one of the things I had to tell you. You need to look for a probate attorney. Here's how to find probate. Does she have the money to have a probate attorney? I don't know, right? Probate also takes time. In Arkansas, the statute of limitations for a will is 5 years. This woman was 3 years in already, right? Do I know? I don't know whether or not she found an attorney and was able to clear things up before her time ran out. She also said in the conversation with me, she said, well, she left the property to a house to me and my brother, right? So it seems like, again, on the surface, very short phone call, it seems on the surface like this will was not structured to eliminate all the problems that are associated with joint ownership, right? So yes, the brother and the sister, assuming they got it straightened out, the brother and sister's name would be on the property, but they're still co-owners of it. They still got to work together, and they're still functionally in a situation that is tangled title heirs property, even though the title isn't technically tangled. So those are some challenges. There are others we could talk about, but while a will is just doing the will, and I'm sure that woman, because I remember being at those wills clinics, people were often so relieved. You could see it on their faces that they got this will done. It wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. Another thing I'll share, again, that this story really highlights, a will may not have been the best tool for her, right? There are transfer on death deeds. Arkansas, they're called beneficiary deeds. If that woman had left her property, her house, which is what we were talking about in this context, if she had left her house and a beneficiary deed, transfer would have been seamless, would have been the kids at the moment she passed away, right? Whether or not the woman knew about beneficiary deeds, actually, I didn't know about beneficiary deeds at that time when I was having that conversation. You know, do people have those tools, those kinds of things? So is a will enough? Maybe, but maybe there's another tool that's even better. And I think we need to be thoughtful about that. The last thing I'll say that I think is really is important here is policy is a really important thing as well, right? There is a law that says the statute of limitations on a will in Arkansas is 5 years. Maybe that's appropriate, maybe it's not. Maybe it should be longer. I'm not an attorney, I don't know. I certainly yield to people who know better. But thinking about the role of policy in this, how do we create an environment where people are more likely to be successful in retaining their property and being able to use the property in the ways that they want to? So those are just a couple things. There's probably more we could share, but I think that story really helps illustrate why just having a will, just being able to say, whew, I got that done. That is great. Kudos for thinking about the future, but it may not be enough.
And I think that's a great segue to move into yet another fascinating report today out of the Urban Institute, courtesy of Mr. Michael Neal. I think everyone in this room knows that the Urban Institute is putting out really important practical research on a regular basis. So I wanted to ask you about this report today on estate planning and technology. What are some of the key takeaways about the challenges that could be addressed by technology but might not be? And what are some of the key potential policy recommendations outlined in that report?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And let me start off. Let me say a couple things before I jump into an answer. Number one, thank you to the JPMorgan Chase for their commitment to this work and to their support of the work that we were able to do. It would not have happened without their support. At the same time, I also want to say that I pride myself on the work that we do, the research that we do, but it happens in community, and it's just an honor to be on the panel with everyone here, but also other researchers who are thinking about these important issues and offering kind of really keen insights into them. So kind of building off of that, one of the things that really struck us, was piggybacking a little bit off of what JP talked about in terms of those that have and will, those that may have an estate plan, and some of those differences among low wealth, low income communities, in particular communities of color. And one of the things that we saw kind of building from that was that they were also, those without a will were also highly unlikely to have more than $500 in financial assets, checking accounts, savings accounts, those highly liquid assets that you can access pretty quickly to make payments. And that for me was really important in terms of informing kind of the response to those that might not have a will, that it's more than just, well, go get one, or go off and find, a lawyer or someone to help you, given the financial constraints that they had. And I think that it also speaks to, and potentially more research kind of in this area, that the risk of tangled title, at least starting with the lack of a will or the lack of an estate plan, really can reflect more systematic challenges that might be at play. And so in my mind, then it morphs from not just, okay, you need to do something about a will, but thinking more holistically, more transformationally around kind of the broader set of challenges that these communities might be experiencing. But at the same time, I think it's also critical to keep in mind that, the way that the world has been changing. The world is changing pretty quickly in very important ways. And one of those ways is certainly around technology and the adoption of technology, the adoption, of digital services taking place in the financial services industry, what we show in our report taking place in the legal services industry, in ways that, as we know from that separate body of work, can exclude senior communities, low-income communities, communities of color, kind of the way that we start to articulate the digital divide. So when we put those two stories together, we kind of started to really think hard about, well, the degree to which there's a solution around technology that can help to reduce costs, that can help to expand outreach. How do we then think about the potential for those tools to not meet those that are most in need? And so that mismatch really kind of becoming pervasive. But the flip side is also true, and that is, what are then the ways in which, as an ecosystem, we can come together and partner with those that are providing those tools, those that are working on the ground, those that are doing the research, in order to ensure that we have that the platforms that are being created will connect to the communities, again, that are most in need. And so it brings us all together into what I hope is an important conversation. And so we hope that kind of the research helps to inform ways that we can overcome this mismatch in order to ensure that everyone is able to benefit from estate planning toward being able to reach their wealth preservation goals. So that was kind of the idea. Those were kind of really some of the main themes that came out of it. And I would say, really, in terms of what those next steps can look like, I think it's really across two dimensions. The first dimension, obvious, right, around how do we provide digital services? How do we make sure that these communities have, access to the internet, that they have computers, and those types of steps. You think about ways in which local communities can provide internet service, ways in which the federal government may have historically provided programs that expanded digital access through connectivity programs, and ways in which we can continue and deepen that. But at the same time, I think there's also this question of what does the marketing and the outreach strategy look like to make sure that they're able to reach that the steps that we take in terms of policy, that the process of them actually ensures that we have our intended results. And so we talk a lot about kind of ways in which we can reach those communities. And then let me just finish up here, and I want to reiterate something that Karama really talked about, which I think is critical, which is, when we think about tangled titles, and fractional ownership, certainly a will and having an estate plan is a key part of that. And JP talked about, kind of first part, and really kind of where that looks like in a proverbial waterfall, so to speak. And Karama really pointed out, that that is not enough, that we need to make sure that the content of the will, the structure of the will, is this even the right tool that we should have, is critically important there. And then, the ways in which, ways in which, I would really kind of build on top of that, is then kind of keeping in mind that, that we have to also think about, what are the challenges, what are some of the other challenges that might be faced in terms of some of those cultural aspects that might give rise, some of those trust aspects as well, that can serve as additional barriers to estate planning and to will making. So what's the key takeaway there? The key takeaway is, while the research that we did certainly was meant to elucidate a strategy that by which we connect with key innovators, at the same time recognizing that it needs to be part of a holistic approach to ensure that we actually address sustainably the challenge around tangled titles.
Well, our discussion has touched on laws and the legal profession quite a bit, so I'd like to now bring in Kiva Terry, a professor of law at Howard University here in Washington, D.C., one of the great institutions, and talk to you about this state law called the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. This is a potential solution. How does this improve the probate process around this issue of tangled titles?
Certainly. So thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I too am delighted to be a part of this panel and to engage in this conversation. Yes, the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, affectionately known as the UPHPA, and so I'll refer to it as both, it addresses a problem that is faced primarily by middle-income, low-income, vulnerable families, and it addresses a problem that they face with regard to their ownership of real property, and that problem is the dispossession of their property through forced sale, right? Sale against their wishes of the property, which of course results in the loss of that wealth within the family. And this has had devastating effects and a devastating impact, in particular on rural African-American families, a growing number of urban families, because as been stated, real estate for many of these families is their most valuable asset. And so the question then is, what protections, what difference does the UPHPA make with respect to property that has been inherited, land or other property inherited from a relative, and when inherited, now the property is held by that person as a tenancy in common. And so if I just walk through some of the enhanced due process and private property rights that the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act provides for these vulnerable families, first let me say the UPHPA requires notice. It requires notice if one of the co-tenants, we have a scenario where a family member has died, most commonly without a will, and as such that property is passed on to their heirs. Perhaps, you know, their children, all of their children have an equal fractional ownership and they own that property as tenants in common. And we call, let's say, each of those children now a co-tenant. And one child wants to sell their interest in the property and another child wants to retain the ownership of the property, perhaps several do. In the absence of the UPHPA, the co-tenant who'd like to sell can go to court, request a partition by sale. The property would be sold. The other co-tenants, the other family members, the other children who wanted to retain ownership of the property would not be able to do so. They would just receive some value, which was usually a very small, substantially discounted value for the property, which of course then wouldn't be passed on, loss of any kind of sentimental, cultural, heritage, community sense with respect to that property. And so the UPHPA now says the co-tenant who'd like to sell their share must provide notice to the other co-tenants. And that notice allows the other co-tenants the opportunity to buy out that co-tenant who wants to sell, right? It's time to make the decision about whether to buy out their interest and time to secure financing to buy out their interest. And that's a way to preserve that property within the family and to maintain that intergenerational wealth. And that's one of the key provisions that is provided in the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. Now, of course, we might have a scenario where the remaining co-tenants, they simply don't have the finances available to buy out that co-tenant. And so now, in that instance, the UPHPA says, well, what are we thinking about? Let's have what we call a partition in kind preference, right? Instead of us moving immediately to sale of the property, is there some way to divide that property so that those who want to retain ownership of the property can do so, and the co-tenant who wants to sell to no longer retain ownership of the property, instead have it, have the money and is able to do so, right? To really think very intentionally about partition in kind being the preference. That's our preferred option. And also to evaluate the property holistically. Before we move to sale, is it possible where one of the co-tenants would be displaced? They are living on the property. And so if we sell it, we might render them homeless. Is there some cultural or historical significance to that property or that community such that a sale would disrupt, kind of the historical significance of that particular area or community? There's a more holistic assessment that the court would make now before we just move immediately to sale, to think about ways as to whether or not partition in kind, a way to divide the property, might be possible such that property ownership can be preserved by those co-tenants who'd like to do so. And then finally, of course, if there's not finances sufficient to buy out the co-tenant who desires to sell, and partition in kind is perhaps just not feasible, and so the only resort is to actually sell the property, there are procedures in place to make sure the property is sold on the open market at an appraised value that would be a fair price to generate maximum value for that family, to preserve as much of their family wealth as possible, even if we're transforming the form of that wealth to maximize the value of that wealth. Unfortunately, historically, these properties would often be subject to real estate speculation. Speculators would buy out that co-tenant, go to court, request a partition by sale. It would be done by auction at what we might call bargain basement prices. By now insisting that if we must go to sale, we do an appraised value for the property, we do an open market procedure to make sure that the property is being sold at its market value, that has a chilling effect on some of these speculators, some of these predatory practices. They're simply not able to make the money they once would have been able to. And so the desire to kind of, pursue some of these predatory practices is just not there. And that in and of itself can have a very valuable stabilizing effect on the communities and for the properties. And these are some of the protections that the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act provides, so that if we do find ourselves faced with heirs property, we can at least try to retain the generational wealth, the intergenerational ownership of said property in ways that wasn't the case prior to the enactment of the UPHPA.
As we so affectionately refer to it. Yes. And is it, my understanding is that about 26 states and the District of Columbia have adopted this law,
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, a vast number of states throughout the country, the District of Columbia as well, have adopted their own versions of the UPHPA. And so I like to say it's sweeping the nation, and a number of states have it under consideration as well.
Well, that's fascinating to think about, and I want to go back to Karama to get into these solutions more. I was really struck by some of the words and concepts involved with this law when you hear about property ownership and home ownership and market forces, and then there's a situation without a free market, without market forces, and the word tenancy really stuck out to me. And especially when we think about investment capital, we've heard about how speculation has entered this equation. So I wanted to ask you, Karama, how can people get involved in working with you towards solutions? Who are the people and organizations who can drive change in this area around tangled titles?
Thank you for that question. I mean, obviously, I think many of the people in this room, the people on these panels who are speaking today, these are folks who are really committed to this work. I think the key thing, I'll piggyback on something that Michael said earlier, is trust, right? These need to be folks who are trusted, who have families at the center of what they're doing, or who are not the speculator, predatory folks that Kiva mentioned. And so I think that trust is really important. I also wanted to just tag on thinking about the work, the paper that's just been released. In the work that I did in financial services previously, what we found oftentimes is that sometimes people were much more excited about working through an app or through something like that because they didn't trust the people who had been predatory in the past, right? And so, of course, you still have to have access to it, right? So it doesn't address that access issue. But if that access issue can be addressed, there may be cases where those kinds of technological tools are actually, people feel more trusted in because they, not necessarily always is true, but they perceive that there's a level playing field there.
Yeah.
So there's something to think about. But I want to think about sort of 5 ways of thinking about who those folks are, right? When we think about the home, there are folks who are involved in the purchase of that home and managing that home, folks like the lenders, housing counselors, credit counselors. These are people who are often well-positioned at an important time to help people think about, you've bought this home. I know you're excited about raising your children there. What do you think about the future on this? Maybe you don't have to do it right now while you're signing all this paperwork, but think about what would it look like to do some estate planning, to do some legacy planning, to be thoughtful about what that looks like. So connecting it to the asset, the people who are connected to the asset. I sort of alluded to this, but connection to an event. Sometimes when people get married or they have a child or they have a second child, right? That second child is sometimes the one that now you're dealing with fractionated interest. A health diagnosis, divorce, loss of parents. Those kinds of things are a good trigger. They may not be a good event, but they can be a good trigger for really thinking intentionally about estate planning and wealth planning. Thinking intentionally about community. Who are the folks who are the trusted messengers who can provide support and thoughtfulness around this? I definitely saw this in the wills clinics that I worked in. Sharing my personal story about certain kinds of estate planning, end-of-life planning, really helped people think differently about it. It wasn't just sort of this abstract concept. They saw what that meant to me personally in certain ways. And so being able to share that really had a difference. And I think when you do that, when that happens within community, it happens in a way that is relevant for people to hear. I know about a group who does a lot of wills clinics, and they do them a lot through churches. And so they talk often about Proverbs 13:22, which says, a good man leaveth an inheritance to his children's children, right? And so for some folks, that's going to be really meaningful in helping them think about why that's important to think about that kind of estate planning. I'd also say connecting to opportunity, being really intentional about wills clinics, about pro bono, low bono attorneys, those kinds of things. Who are the folks who can get that done? What are the opportunities for getting that work done, and how do you connect people to it? And then finally, we touched on this a little bit already, but connecting to policy, right? Policymakers who can change policy, like things like getting the UPHPA passed in 26 states and jurisdictions across the country. Changing policy like the FEMA work that we heard from Christopher Smith earlier. Policy makes a huge difference in setting a stage for folks to be successful. And so I would lift that up as another piece. Policymakers who are informed, who are thinking about this issue from the perspective of families, who are trusted trusted partners who are working in this space, can really make a huge difference.
Well, and in thinking about policy, that leads to the current legal landscape. So I wanted to ask Kiva, how does this existing legal landscape put this real estate wealth at risk?
Yes, thank you for the question. So, and just thinking about what might be some of the legal difficulties, I must say, I really believe probate itself is a significant challenge. Yes. The fact that the assets must be probated. And that means that in most states, we have to go to court. And that can be, in and of itself, a very difficult experience for individuals to kind of be familiar enough with the court system, comfortable enough with the court system to even know. And Karama's story that she experienced with the person who called you is, and the statute of limitations with the probate process. So probate in and of itself is a legal structure that I think has made made it difficult to preserve generational wealth. I completely agree that we need to think comprehensively about estate planning. And what I mean by that is just thinking about the work of the Estate Planning and Heirs Property Clinic at Howard University School of Law and their approach to creating the estate plans for their clients. They do craft and draft wills, but they also incorporate non-probate transfers as part of the comprehensive estate plan. So that, and the research backs this up. Research findings reveal that for many Black and Latino families, a bank account is their only financial assets, that many and most of the small estates are just people who are probating bank accounts and motor vehicles. And so thinking about some of these non-probate options like payable on death bank accounts where a beneficiary can be named for that bank account outside of the probate process in a much simpler way where the beneficiary can simply go to the local branch and provide the death certificate and ID and receive the proceeds of the account. The same way with naming a beneficiary for a motor vehicle, where the beneficiary can simply go to the DMV, places that individual and community members frequent in many instances already. Provide the death certificate and their ID, and the title will automatically be changed on the car, on the motor vehicle, to the beneficiary. And as Karama mentioned, transfer on death deeds does the exact same thing in 20 or 30 states right now outside of the probate process, where individuals would be able, while they are alive, to fill out a 1 or 2 page form, a very simple form, easy to understand, which is great for our seniors and folks who might be a little overwhelmed, by documents and have trust issues. Naming a beneficiary, it's something that is then recorded at the deeds office who sends out their property taxes. And it's kind of an office that we're already dealing with if you own property. And then the beneficiary simply goes to that recorder of deeds, shows the death certificate and their ID, and the property is automatically retitled in the beneficiary's name. It's a way to preserve that generational wealth with respect to the property outside of the probate process. So for those who might be a little apprehensive about the courts, for the reasons that Karama mentioned, the time, the money, the fear, the uncertainty, the feeling that I might need an attorney to help me, the beneficiary who's grieving and suffering at the time of the loss of their loved one, these are just easier, these non-probate options, and the transfer on death deeds specifically with respect to real property, which is the law in 20 to 30 states around the country now, right, is something that I think we should really encourage and incorporate as part of our estate plans along with a will, and I think that will help preserve a greater degree of generational wealth within the families, especially the most vulnerable families.
Well, there were a lot of great solutions there, particularly among people who have very valid reasons for hesitation and wariness around this entire process, around the concept of wealth and money in general. But I want to ask everyone on the entire panel, if we can just go down the line about solutions, to ask you, what are some of the most promising advancements or solutions that could really make a big impact? JP, can you start for us?
Yeah, and I was just actually talking to Karama before this about some of the questions I had about joint ownership and how to think about that. I think a lot of times the focus is on, rightly so, on loss of wealth, like wealth being taken away from families. But there's also the question of how do you maximize the wealth so that it doesn't lay fallow, I guess. And so, when you have a joint asset like a house that requires maintenance, that doesn't create obvious income, What are the structures that you'd want to set up so that decisions can be made for maximizing wealth over time, rather than just shared ownership? Are there ways to define decision-making in a more corporate model or a co-op model? And so what are the structures you can build into almost as a default for trust or wills that help not just pass along the asset, but also pass along a framework for making joint decisions with the asset?
Karama?
So I was really intrigued. I did not know the data that you mentioned, JP, earlier about the rate of will making decreasing over time. Yeah. So everybody's going in the wrong direction, it sounds like, which is not ideal. But I pair that with Kiva, what you were sharing earlier, is like the prevalence of the availability of something like a transfer on death deed, are called other things in other places. And I think as we think about what these tools are, some of these tools we already have in place. We already have them. We need to know about them. I didn't know, when this woman called me, I didn't know what a transfer on death deed was. And then when I heard about transfer on death deeds, I didn't know that they're called something different in the state where I live, right? So really being intentional, and I think forums like this, the fact that this is recorded, and maybe folks will share it and learn some things from it and use it going forward. But these kinds of conversations where we not only talk about these tools, and to your point, JP, develop new tools where those need to be in place, but where we also increase the visibility of those tools and we increase the accessibility of those tools. So it's not just sitting there and nobody knows that, man, this would have been the easiest thing to do, right? If I just had this transfer on death deed, this all would have been done at no cost, quickly, and without publicity and exposure, right? These tools are out, many of these tools are out there, and we just need to increase their visibility, increase their accessibility.
Michael?
Yeah, I swear, Chrome is always a tough act to follow every time. Let me say a couple of things. I think the first one for me is a growing understanding about the cultural differences around housing, homeownership, and wealth. And I think it's important, when we talk about solutions, that we're not implying that somehow those that want to do this are doing it wrong. And I think one of the first places where we start to really test that and understand that is when we look at other communities, when we look at Native communities, when we look at Hispanic communities, when we look at other communities who really, whether it's multi-generational housing, whether it's collective housing, this is a part of their culture. And I think some of the research coming out of places like the Boston Foundation that really articulate kind of those cultural differences, I think is critical for the paradigm that we have in mind that somehow what they are doing is wrong. And I don't know if that's exactly the right way to approach this issue. So that for me is number one, is more research, more knowledge, really helping us to understand how this is really embedded in the cultures of different communities. The second one for me is, just lifting up, I think, some of the work that Christopher talked about earlier around the financial products that are guarding against financial inclusion. Heirs property can, in a lot of situations, result in exclusion from the financial system, ways in which we can develop financial tools that can continue to include them and ensure that some of the challenges around heirs property, like the physical adequacy of the property, which in turn speaks to the value and the wealth provided by the home itself, I think is another important kind of tool. It's just really been encouraging to see all of the people who have been thinking hard, about different aspects of that type of product. For me, the third one are those organizations and those platforms that are creating internet-based ways of creating estate planning and will making, and the degree to which they can partner. Karama talked about wills clinics. Kiva talked about wills clinics. Ways in which they can partner with the strategies that we have in place toward driving, greater expansion. Hopefully, even shifting, reversing some of those trends that JP talked about, I think is another solution, and one that was implied by the work that we're doing. And then finally, let me end with, I think, another critical solution, and it really kind of started off in the first, in the fireside chat, was actually raising up what heirs property is and helping people to understand its features, its characteristics, what are the rules to protect yourself, and the more, kind of piggybacking off of what Karama said, the more that these type of events, that more this information starts to flow in different places around the country, I think is going to be critical toward exposing this issue as a problem, developing precision around its contours as part of a solution set toward building resilience.
Great. Kiva?
I echo what all of the co-panelists have said. I really feel like for the vulnerable families, it is a lack of information. They really do not know. They don't know how best to pass on the property. They don't know these various tools. They don't know how to access assistance. It is an information, a lack of information. I encourage my students to think of themselves, and I would encourage all of us to think of ourselves as ambassadors, to go out and to share this information with your families, your communities, your organization, because there is a information deficit that I think is the greatest challenge. And so to the degree that we can share the information about these various tools, right, a will and some of these other will substitutes, these non-probate options that would exist, I think that would help to prevent the creation of heirs property as, kind of from the outset, and to prevent some of the tangled titles that result, and thinking about technology that can assist in that and make that process easier. I just give one example. My students created an Instagram post. This wasn't about the transfer on death deeds. The Instagram post that they created was about the payable on death bank accounts. But the same thing could be done about transfer on death deeds, or with some statistics about the importance of creating a will, but utilizing those social media, and some of the tools, just thinking about that as an avenue for communication and information sharing, I think that could be a very useful option as well.
Well, with that spirit of information sharing, we're going to open it up for Q&A. We've got some great questions coming in from our remote audience, and anyone here in person, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll try to get to you as well. But I'll start out with the first question that came in around the topic of long-term care costs and the fact that many families are forced to sell or encumber a primary residence, often undermining their ability to pass that wealth to the next generation. What strategies, whether through tech or estate planning tools, can best preserve housing equity for vulnerable older adults while still ensuring they have access to the care that they need? Mm-hmm. It's a huge question. Anyone have some thoughts there?
Well, at the center we think about this a lot. So long-term care is a growing issue. Medicaid is the primary provider, but most middle-income families that are homeowners don't qualify. You have to have assets of under $2,000, and obviously a house most of the time is worth more than that. And so at the center, what we would say is the house is an asset. That part of the reason you have it is as insurance for some of these kinds of shocks. And so if you think about it as savings, in some respect, then that's what the house is there for. It is an asset that you can use as just like a financial asset to help you defray cost in retirement. It is savings. That's how we think about it at the center. It's not the way most people think about the house. I understand that. It has other value. But there is a financial aspect to the house that I think is sometimes ignored, and touching the house sometimes seems like people are loath to touch the house because they don't see it as a financial asset, when in fact, that's where they've been putting most of their savings over their work life.
Well, another question, and we have talked about this a little bit, but just to drive the point home, we have an audience member asking, with the existing lack of intentional policies to address tangled title, why is it common for homes with the tangled titles to be sold quickly for under market value? Please, Keith. Thank you.
Sure. So I think it ties directly into what Chris was talking about during the fireside chat, the inability to access financing. And so in many instances, because of the tangled title, individuals are not able to secure financing so the house will fall into some degree of disrepair. They're not able to necessarily have access to features like the home equity line of credit to do some household repairs, or to take a second mortgage to replace the roof, because this is the same house that my grandmother owned and that my mother owned, and that has been, and the lack of access, and why are you not able? Because the applicant is not necessarily the person who is the legal owner of the property. We may have some difficulty with property taxes having accumulated through the years because the property tax bill was being mailed in the name of perhaps the person who's deceased, and so we didn't realize that there were outstanding property taxes that have now accumulated, and we're perhaps at risk of the city auctioning off that house due to the outstanding property taxes. But all of these I think, kind of extreme financial circumstances where the heirs or the members of the family who are living in the house, but not technically on the title for the house, are faced with, they do not have the liquid cash to pay for some of the household repairs that might be necessary to maintain the city inspection, or to just be able to, live in a habitable fashion, or to pay any of the outstanding taxes or utility bills, as the case may be. And all of that leads sometimes to, a quick sale because they need the cash, and the sale might be at a discounted price. I'm just thinking about some of the scenarios that give rise to that.
Can I just say too, I 100% agree with that, and I would just add, thinking about place is also a really important factor in this. You find if you're in a place where there are increasing, a really hot housing market, or increasing rising home prices, there's a lot of gentrification going on, those kinds of things, particularly if it's in a place that doesn't have the protections that Kiva so eloquently described from the UPHPA. You can find folks who they want housings, and they want land to build bigger houses on. And if there's not a lot of other places to build because of that particular market or where it's geographically located or those kinds of things, then those predatory people that Kiva also mentioned can come in, purchase an interest, and then use all the tools that are there, especially again if there's not other kinds of legal policy protections in place, to force those kinds of sales very quickly. And I think it's because those kinds of things have happened many times over the years in many places, that you see so many states adopting things like the UPHPA to provide those protections, to at least give folks, as you said earlier, we talked about noticing and those kinds of things, at least a little bit of time to try to figure out, can we pull together the dollars to keep our home?
Let me just bring in really quickly, because Kiva, you said something that kind of motivated my own thinking. I want to return to your first question around kind of health. And certainly that question was posed as, what are the implications of health on housing outcomes? But I also think, in part because of kind of what you were saying, Kiva, that there's this question of what's the implication of housing on health outcomes? And particularly some of the work that we did showed that those who inherit their home are more likely to live in physically inadequate properties than even renters. And so we know as a traditional kind of stylized fact that, homeowners are less likely to live in dilapidated housing than renters. But in fact, when you break that out by how you got your home, did you buy an existing home? Did you build a new home? Did you inherit your home? We see pretty clearly that those that inherited their home are more likely to live in these types of structures compared to even renters. But then that pairs with, I think, some research that we've done, but really the broader kind of body of research that really connects the structure and the physical structure of the property with health outcomes. That if you live in physically inadequate homes, it can ultimately lead to people who wind up ultimately requiring that kind of, additional care. In our work, what we saw was that physically inadequate properties meant that you had higher energy costs. And because you had higher energy costs hitting up against lower incomes, those people were energy cost burdened. They had to make decisions about, do I pay for my energy? Do I buy food? Any of those decisions have health ramifications. And so that's kind of, as you put these bodies of work together, one way in which you start to think about heirs property, the degree to which those are older homes, they might be physically inadequate. What does that mean if someone is occupying it in terms of their health?
Wow. So many issues intertwined with this one. We're out of time. It's been such a rich discussion here. We will be bringing out Sarah Stein of the Atlanta Fed next, but let's have a round of applause for this amazing panel. Thank you.
Good evening. I've been asked to synthesize and reflect on the discussion that we just had. My name's Sarah Stein. I'm a senior advisor in community economic development at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And my comments are mine alone and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta or the Federal Reserve System. I've been honored to be a part of work at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta that we've done to research and engage to build a body of evidence and capacity to address heirs property owners' difficulties accessing their generational wealth, part of our efforts to build an economy that works for everyone. And I've had the pleasure of knowing many of the people on this panel and learning alongside them. Tonight, we have had the opportunity to hear some stories about, to borrow Christopher Smith's language, legacy and preservation. Stories of individual families that they live out and one that spans a population. JP noted that research shows a mass wealth transfer that approaches from the baby boomer generation. Much of this wealth is in real property, and JP also shared that legacy planning may not be in place at a population level, which will play out in the lives of families where their home may be the only asset. Michael's research also speaks to this. So we have a population level narrative on our hands, lived out by individual families in communities across this country. Karama brought us two stories at the individual level, her own and one from a family that she was present to literally witness. Those stories show us that as we think through solutions, we must ask, what is the best way to secure and shape a legacy in the image of each family's needs, desires, practices, and in the context of the system that that legacy will need to navigate and survive? Michael zoomed back out to the population level story to demonstrate evidence that solutions can exist and be shaped to scale options for broader access. He noted a barrier to this in digital inaccess for many families. Another caveat that was addressed in conversation is that we should ensure that technology developed to respond at scale, addressing that population level issue, is nimble and tailored enough to meet the needs of those individual legacies. And Kiva brought home the impact that fractional and clouded title can have in thwarting families from preserving their legacy and blocking access to measures and instruments of preservation. the options and choices at their disposal, and the creativity that drive the proliferation and access to those choices walk a tightrope across a landscape of potential loss. She noted the importance of considering the instruments as well as the processes and systems they operate in, like the probate process, when thinking through how to build opportunity. I'd like to thank the brilliant panelists for helping us weave these stories all together and lifting them up for consideration. Excellent food for thought as we head into the next panel entitled Protecting the American Dream, Legislative Solutions for Supporting Heirs Property Owners. This will be moderated by Jade Bristol, the Senior Director of Planned Giving at Earth Justice. Thank you all. Sorry.
Thanks everyone for sticking with us. I hope you all enjoyed that first panel discussion as much as I did. We are now teeing up our second panel discussion, which is going to focus a little more on practical and legislative solutions to the problem of heirs property. And we have a wide variety of panelists with us. We have people who work in the legal field, in the tech field, directly in heirs property, people who work in wealth. So there's a great wealth of expertise up here to talk about the different angles that we can approach the problem of heirs property from. So I'd like to go ahead and kick it off to Adam. And I'd like to just ground ourselves first in why this is important. So in 1963, Malcolm X told us that land is the basis of independence. And that's really what we're talking about at its core here, is maintaining generational independence and building generational wealth. So if we could spend a minute talking a little bit about what are some of the barriers that you see to people creating the plans that they need in order to preserve that generational wealth of land and real estate, and also just the importance of preserving that generational wealth over time.
Thanks, Jaden. Good to be here. Thank you, everybody. So my name is Adam Frank. I'm the Managing Director, Head of Wealth Planning and Advice for JP Morgan Chase. In terms of the barriers, I think a lot of the first panel talked about them. It's cost, it's access, it's knowing people in the community who do this kind of thing. I think calling it estate planning, people hear estate, and I think somebody mentioned this, like, I don't have an estate, right? I have a home, I have $50,000 in a bank account. That's not an estate. They think Wayne Manor is an estate. So there are language barriers that are part of this. I think there's a lack of understanding of the process that needs to be gone through in order to legally transfer the title of real estate. It's not just having a will, which is the first step and is very important. It's having a will, and then I think Kiva said it earlier, taking it to probate. And then going through the probate process, which is time-consuming and potentially costly and very administratively burdensome. And then it's taking the papers that you get, the letters from the court, and going to the county clerk's office with a new deed from the estate to the heirs. And so I think all of that, the lack of understanding of what needs to be done, and then a lack of knowledge, and frankly, I think for a lot of people who are subject to heirs property, it's a lack of time and a lack of attention. People who live in rural areas and live hundreds of miles from a courthouse, most of this is not digitized. You can't go online and file with the clerk's office a new deed. You have to go to the clerk's office and hand them the $5 filing fee or whatever it is, along with the physical deed, or mail it in. And people don't have the experience or understanding or information. And I know a number of the people on the prior panel talked about it, and we were talking about it in prep. But I think those are the biggest barriers. And a lot of it is the traditional ones of cost and trust in the system and so forth, but just the practicalities and the administrative perseverance that's required to actually follow through and go from beginning, which is somebody's dying, to end, which is having a deed registered in the names of the new owners, often doesn't happen. And I think that's problematic and I think much more difficult to overcome. Even the transfer on death deeds that the panel was talking about, you still have to transfer on death deed, that's great. There are different states have implemented different ways, and you were telling me about this, have implemented different ways of doing that. And some states require you to go to court or to come with your death certificate and to give notice to the family and. And the more of those things there are, the harder it is, I think, for people to follow through, even with the best of intentions, because it's not easy even for somebody who knows what they're doing. But if somebody knows what they're doing, they know they're doing the right thing and they know what the payoff will be, so the headache and hassle are worth it. People who don't know what they're doing aren't necessarily confident that they know what the outcome is going to be. And so it's often just very daunting to go into the court system if you're not familiar with it and go through all of these steps.
Great, thank you. Did you want to talk a little bit about the importance of preserving generational wealth?
Yeah, I knew there was another question.
That's all right.
Sorry. I mean, I think it's very important, right? It's the way that families can bring themselves up in the world, right? Can move up the class scale, if you will. But it's important to have the processes and the understand what the process is of creating generational wealth and how to preserve it. And a number of the prior panel talked about the issues with co-ownership. Even if you have a will and even if you've gone through probate, co-ownership is tremendously complicated. And having a governance framework and a governance structure and all of that, right? We talk about it as family governance, but that sounds very daunting to people, right? That's like a thing, and this is not a thing. This is just I have a house and I want to make sure my kids keep it and can use it and pass it on to their kids, and as its value grows, their wealth grows, and they can do better for their kids than I've been able to do for them, and et cetera, through the generations. And without any planning at all, and I think PJ talked about that as in the retirement aspect and the long-term care. Without any planning, it's much more difficult to be successful and to achieve those goals. So the will or the estate plan or whatever you want to call it is the first piece of that plan, and then executing the plan, which means maintaining the documents as people get married or divorced, as there are births and deaths, as people move in and out of your life, as circumstances change, as you move from one house to another, making sure that the documents, if you've got them in place, reflect your current goals. And if you don't have them in place, knowing what you need to do in order to effectively achieve those goals And it's that knowing what to do. It sounds easy when I'm sitting up here, we're sitting up here talking about it. It's very difficult for people who aren't doing this all the time in some fashion or other, even to know what questions to ask. So like, what do I Google to find out that I have heirs property? I have no idea that heirs property is a thing. I just know that my 2 brothers and I own this house, and my brother died, and his kids now like own some of it because that's what he wanted. And like, I have no idea what to ask. And I think that the educational piece and getting into the communities, and the number of the panel in the last questions talked about this, I think that's a critical aspect to overcoming some of the barriers.
Thank you. I think that educational piece of what you're talking about is incredibly important. And one of the things that you're going to hear from these panelists is more about how partnerships can help solve that educational component for the communities that we're talking about. So I'm going to pass it over to Chris and Abraham now to talk about the work that their organizations are doing with various communities around the heirs property issue.
Sure. Jade, thanks so much for that. Again, my name is Chris Garland. I work with an organization called NCST, the National Community Stabilization Trust. And it's probably helpful maybe to back up a little bit who our organization is and how we're involved and what brings us into the airship workspace. We've been around since 2008. All the while, our organization has really been centered on affordable homeownership. And so the way that looks is our organization provides support to community-based groups all around the country, right? So these are nonprofits, developers, governments, land banks, and we provide them support through our legacy program, which is about connecting them with holders of foreclosed properties, so that access to inventory. But we also provide support by way of research, policy support, and also technical assistance, right? And again, all of that with that focus, not just in affordable housing, but affordable homeownership. And so it's with that lens that it really brings us to working in the heirs property space. And by the way, we're able to provide this work with the generous support of JPMC as well. So thank you for that. Our program, the way that we deliver this work is we've pulled together what we call a learning cohort. A group of organizations all throughout the country. We're working with 3 this year. We'll be growing this in 2026 and beyond, both in terms of size and geography. But our 2025 cohort is a group in Baltimore and in Birmingham, Alabama, and in Atlanta. We get together on a weekly basis with a program associate, a principal staff assigned to this learning effort, and really try and cover all things heirs properties. It's really about that intersection between community development and heirs property. So think unpacking, as an example, the link between taxation and homestead exemptions, thinking through how to tap into home repair programs as an example, and then really weaving that into where might there be a challenge in an heirship situation. And this is what community development professionals, by and large, do really well, right? They tend to know a lot about a lot of things and also help provide that solution and work through that. So our immersion into this is one that is this year-long effort. We get together both virtually and in person and have that make that a learning experience for them. They're also involved, by the way, in special projects, unpacking something local that's important to their organization and help solve a problem in the airship tangled title space within their respective communities. Some of the learning, right? If you're thinking like, well, what does this actually look like? Some of the learning, a great example would be we had a session just about a month or so ago with Sarah Stein, who was just speaking. Sarah did this great session where she educated our team around home repair programs, right? But in advance of that, and this was really crucial, each one of the organizations did research on home repair programs within their own communities, right? Paying particular attention to the definitions, what was necessary in order to participate, in order to be eligible to take advantage of that program. And so then as we explored that with Sarah's guidance, we were able to see if there were actual handicaps in place that would prevent a potential family from taking part in a home repair program that really was designed to support them in the first place. That's that kind of armament, that kind of knowledge that we really lean into with this program. And I guess in summary, what I'd say is there's work that's happening all around the country, and we really think there can be more of that we can help support.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Abraham Reyes Pardo. I'm the Vice President of Housing at the Urban League of Greater Philadelphia. The Urban League of Greater Philadelphia is an affiliate of the National Urban League. So I'm here standing really on the shoulders of giants. As many of you know, Philadelphia has already an existing ecosystem that is, in some ways, I want to say that I come from the future, bringing good news for you, where some of the work around tangled titles started in Philadelphia when ADIDOTs were transformed into data back in 2005 by the work of Kelly Gastley at Philly VIP. And then other organizations quickly followed, like Community Legal Services, Philadelphia Legal Assistance, Senior Law. So when I was tasked with leading the Philly 5 Collaborative, supported by Wells Fargo back in 2021, oh my gosh, it feels like a long time ago, I wanted to incorporate tangled titles as part of the work that we will be offering. And I knew that there was already an existing infrastructure that I needed to tap into. So I convened with the several institutions that I named, and I came in humble and listening to what the needs were. I was not in a position, first of all, I'm not an attorney. I was not in a position to tell them what to do, but rather I needed for them to tell me what they needed, right? For me, it was a little bit evident that a couple of them were working on silos, whether it was because of the circumstances or because some of them were holding their cards too close to their chest, right? So what my work really became is to convene these groups by providing human and financial resources to accelerate and expand the work that they were doing. Coincidentally, in a form of a perfect storm, the Pew Charitable Trust published a study in 2021 where they kind of labeled the deceased. They talked about how 10,000 families were going through that. They put a price to what on average it takes to fix a tangled title. That was the work of Octavia Howell during her time at the Pew Charitable Trust. And for me, that is a conversation that I was having with these groups, right? And also, that is something else that happened back then when the city of Philadelphia decided to put $6 million towards that as part of the neighborhood preservation initiative, which was a 4-year plan. For those of you who are following politics in Philadelphia, now we're entering the era of a $2 billion plan that also includes work around or support for tangled title work. So the table is set, right? You may be thinking, there are no challenges in Philadelphia. Oh yeah, there are still some challenges. And our work is being a more intentional with the needs of historically marginalized groups, right? Race covenants have created a tradition of disengagement, of miseducation or failed education opportunities where African Americans, Jews, Asian Americans were excluded from owning property, inheriting property in certain sections of the city. And even though it's now illegal since 1948, you will still, it's fascinating to read through some of the language on these deeds, right? But even though legislatively the problem has been fixed, there's still a tradition of people who distrust the system. So what we're doing is we are educating and re-educating the community by meeting them where they are, in houses of worship, by running workshops where we talk about estate planning, when we talk about tangled titles, where we're elevating these conversations. And because the National Urban League, the Urban League are trusted organizations within the community, we're stamping our approval. We're bringing people directly to what it's meant to be the real source of the situation. So I mentioned education. I mentioned financial support. One of the things that we are doing is, and one of the things, and one of the challenges, and where we are behind is on the legislative side. We don't have a transfer on death situation. So through Philly 5000, we created a little grant to support, again, not reinventing the wheel, to support the existing work of organizations that were already on their way, and with that, we're going to push them. We're trying to push them to the finish line, right? I don't mean, you can tell that I don't mean to claim ownership of any of this. I'm a firm believer that the knowledge should be shared amongst practitioners and amongst the community. Someone was saying that on the previous panel, become an ambassador of this type of work. What we're finding out is that a lot of people still don't know what a tangled title, what heirs property is. So we are often translating that information to them. The problem and the challenge becomes that it is at a time where unfortunately there might be other crises as well. Foreclosure prevention, behind on property taxes, trying to collateralize a house, right? So you have the crisis within the crisis. And some of these families may face challenges in understanding the terminology, the legalese that comes with these types of situations. So we have to literally hold hands, and it takes a housing counselor, a legal expert, advocacy for us to get someone to the finish line and to gain their trust and help them get the type of help that they need.
Thank you so much for that wonderful explanation of the way that you are both working with the communities that you're located in to help bring solutions to this problem. You may have noticed that many of our panelists tonight, both on this panel and the first panel, keep bragging about not being lawyers. But next, we're going to pass it over to the two lawyers on our panel, Brantley Boyette and Mavis Gregg, who have both worked on this issue from different sides of it from a technology standpoint. So Brantley has worked on it from an estate planning standpoint, and Mavis has worked on this from a title work standpoint. And I'd love, Mavis, for you to walk us through this idea that you had for a software to help implement title work, which can otherwise be an incredibly lengthy process for families with tangled title, and how you're seeing some of the results of that work where you are.
Hi, everyone. So I am a death and dirt attorney, and I had a law practice, a private law practice, where I sought to work with heirs property owners and demonstrate that this is a mainstream thing, not a charitable thing or a poverty thing. But in my practice as a solo practitioner, I grew very frustrated with the fact that while I'm educating folks about having succession plans, having an entity-centered model for owning their real estate, many of them would come to me for succession planning services, but we don't have any proof of who owns the property that they are coming to plan for, meaning that the ownership of their property was passing from person to person or family members to family members through inheritance. A lot of people don't know this, but there are only two ways to transfer real estate. One is a deed, which is an intentional act, but the other way is naturally occurring. It's death. We all, when we die, our real estate, our assets go to someone else. And so what was happening, what I was seeing in that people wanted to have a stable form of ownership that would endure across generations, we had to first build a family tree, and I'll tell you why, to actually do the legal analysis. And there's no family tree builder platform that really supports the type of data that attorneys need and the organization of that data. The attorneys that I work with, we have lots of Post-its, spreadsheets, family search, ancestry. And believe it or not, even though attorneys are great at a lot of things, we're not always great at technology, even myself. But suffice it to say that with my practice, I was only able to work with 2 or 3 families at a time. And we're talking about families who are land rich, cash poor, and for whom they were exhausting their resources, paying me to build a family tree. And so, you know, I figured we've had Napster, we then graduated to Rhapsody, and now we have Spotify. Technology has done a lot to change the way we think about things that we're used to. And so I wanted to answer the question of what can technology do to make it easier to trace ownership of family inherited real estate. And so we set out to build that. And we're still learning. It's hard, the amount of data that's needed to trace ownership from like 1911 to 2023 is a lot, and it takes a lot of stuff. But in the meantime, what we also learned from the attorneys that are heirs property practitioners is that on top of needing a platform to source data and organize it, to do their legal analysis on title, they just need data. Meaning that the amount of work we have to do to go out there in the public records, to interview family members, all the stuff that we have to collect to do our job is pretty big. And if we think about how much heirs property there is, like my home state of North Carolina has this, I think has the second most, I can't say the, we have a lot. We have a lot of heirs property. And so how, if you only have a few attorneys doing this, how can you actually achieve impact at scale? So then that's where we turn to our data work. So HeirShares will be the first for-profit organization or non-university, non-federal agency to do heirs property mapping for the purpose of building data for title work. And I think what's interesting about this conversation around technology and estate planning, within the heirs property attorney network, there is an actual network called HAPPN, the Heirs Property Practitioner Network. We often talk about this, you know, what type of planning do our clients need? We really do need multi-generational planning, and estate planning is personal to the individual, meaning that you can only control so far from the grave. But what I think is a real opportunity for us, and I think, you know, what I'll hear from our other lawyer, is that estate planning can actually be the gateway into more comprehensive planning that Adam was talking about, and the gateway into people getting more comfortable with our legal systems. As we've heard, lots of people are uneasy with dealing with our legal systems, but I think through estate planning and building these long-term relationships with, you know, it's often cross-sector partnerships, we can really galvanize a change in perspective on what it means to plan. I love what you said about wealth and people's perception of wealth. In my view, everything is wealth, so regardless of the size. But if you do have a smaller wealth, you actually need more planning. And so we have that, and then we have a learning platform called Death and Dirt, and it's asynchronous online learning about every aspect of heirs property. And the objective was to make it easy for both service providers but also homeowners to understand what are the different ways in which these things work and what are things that they can do. So every chapter has micro movements of actions that they can take towards their family property. So yeah, that's what I do.
Thank you. Amazing solution to a difficult problem. So now I'm going to turn it over to Brantley. Brantley, you founded a company that provides an online estate planning platform. Can you share with us a little more about how you navigated some of the legalities around online estate planning, and also talk about maybe the current status and some of the limitations of those platforms?
Sure, of course. Thank you, and thank you for having me. Thank you guys for being here. In 2015, my co-founders and I had this vision that we were going to provide online estate planning essentially for free to the end users through nonprofit organizations, with the idea that nonprofits would sponsor the estate planning tools for the people they serve, their volunteers, patients, alumni, donors, with the ostensible goal of, you know, legacy giving, but also creating more of a sense of community. And we, you know, early on, I went to the University of Texas Law School, and I went to a University of Texas event that was about legacy giving, and found one of the attorneys that they work with to paper legacy gifts. And I told her what I was doing, And she got visibly angry, and she said, you can't do that. You're going to get disbarred. We're all going to get sued. The University of Texas is going to get sued. And people like me that work with the university will never talk to the university again. So I said, hi, I'm Brantley. She said, I'm Rhonda. I said, look, Rhonda, actually, you know, the first people I went to talk to was the State Bar of Texas. And they told me that they had fought this fight with LegalZoom for about a dozen years, and they lost handily, and they changed their mind. They actually think it's good for more people to have access to legal documentation, and specifically through platforms, so they endorsed me doing this. The other 2 points, thank you, well taken. I'd be happy to talk about this more. And she said, sure, and we had lunch a few times, and then a year and a half later, she called me, and she said, I want you to know I was wrong. And I was like, what part were you wrong about? And she said, I just went down and volunteered for a clinic in San Antonio. There's a ton of people that can't afford attorneys. It's more than I'd really seen like in person. And they can't, it's not just that they can't afford, they have valid reasons not to want to go to a law office, not to want to be involved in the court system. And I think what you're doing is actually really powerful. I want to be an advisor to the company. I want to help whatever way I can. Same year, she won the Distinguished Lifetime Award for Texas Probate, so she ended up being a heck of an advisor and still a very close friend. And I always fly down to Austin to teach one of her classes every year. She's retired now, but essentially as we've grown, so LegalZoom was kind of like the first phase of online estate planning and Rocket Lawyer. My company and a couple others were phase 2, that was 2010s, after the legal battles were fought. And then there's like a phase 3, which is things that have popped up after the pandemic. So pandemic happens, 3 weeks in, Rhonda Brink calls me and she says, can I have a giving docs for my clients? And I said, are you sure that's what you want? She said, I'm working 18 hours a day. I have more people lined up to do their estate planning than I can handle, and some of these people are gonna die on me. Yeah. And that created kind of this acceptance of online estate planning as a thing that we hadn't really experienced before. And so that was kind of a big step forward. And now we have different players in the space that are coming at it from different angles, which I think is great. And the technology and artificial intelligence allows these platforms to be built in record speed. And AI is actually really getting good at legal research and legal analysis now. And we still have humans to double check it, of course, but like it does things that, you know, would have taken us a very long time 10 years ago when we started. So I think the access will continue to grow, but we're always going to have these legal things in place that are going to make it more difficult. We talked about probate. There's not a tech fix for probate. There is no tech fix for probate in sight at the moment. One of the things that I've been really hopeful about since we started was that we would have an end-to-end solution for creating an estate plan that was signed and notarized. I figured it'd only be a couple of years. And what we find today is, you know, there's 15 states that have specifically said that remote online notarization can be used for wills. There's more, I think it's around 20 that have specifically said remote online notarization cannot be used for wills. There's a handful that have said remote online notarization is cool, nothing about wills. And then of those 15 states that allow for it, there's different rules on witnessing. Can the witnesses be remote online? Most are silent on that. In order to have an end-to-end solution that's really inclusive, like that would be the best solution possible, to have 3 notaries, 2 of whom serve as witnesses. They all pop up on your screen. Get the whole thing done right there, and then you have a secure document. There's custodian issues in some states, so they're just not problems that are easily solved by tech. We can get some of the way there, and the interesting thing, most of these policy changes are being driven by tech solutions for profit, not because they're trying to do the right thing, but because they want to be the best solution for customers who pay them, or you know, whoever the customer may be. So that is to say there's people out there working on that problem, and we've had incredible success with getting this in the hands of people that really need it. But I'll finish with this. As of last year, 70% of US adults still did not have any type of estate plan, which means that if we put it in banking terms, 70% of US adults are operating unbanked in regards to the largest financial transaction of their life.
Thank you. I know that we are just about out of time. I do want to make sure we touch on how partnerships between technology, attorneys, community organizations can help facilitate solutions to these challenges. And I think some of that is going to come out as we address some of the questions that have come in. So if it's okay, let's turn to some of these questions. The first question is about AI. And it is, what do you think about the role that AI has for the community, specifically around preserving wealth? And
Sounds
feel
like
free
a
to-
question for you.
I'm probably
It's very broad.
probably
I have
the one to
opinions,
do that.
but-
So it's a really interesting question, and it's this really fuzzy area around unauthorized practice of law. So we've seen other players in the space start handing these tools to financial advisors, and financial advisors essentially doing people's estate plan with them, which just butts right up against the edge of what might be unauthorized practice of law. And if there's a financial incentive to do so, people are going to poke at that bubble, right? They're going to see that's what happened with LegalZoom in 2000. They got in a fight with the state bar. The juice was worth the squeeze. They won. So I do think that the state bars and attorneys are slow to react to this stuff, that people are going to test the limits. It's not like Uber wasn't really allowed to go do what Uber did. There was laws in place about taxis, but they did it anyway. And then it became normalized and they couldn't take it back. So I think I'm hopeful that it's net positive. I think we're gonna see kind of potentially changes in the way people think about how they approach estate planning there first. Obviously on the implementation side, there's safeguards in place that are gonna be around for a while. But my hope is that people will have more access to useful information than they ever have before, and that allows them to deal with a lot of the issues that we're talking about tonight.
I have an idea, but you're gonna have to hire me first. I'm not joking. I do have an idea.
It sounds like a
I haven't
partnership in
I don't know the
making.
user experience for your platform, but I would love to see it. And I do have ideas about AI as it relates to the end user. But I will say from the developing perspective, in the back end, AI has been pretty significant in AirShares developing our technology, even down to writing code. You know, my co-founder is a mathematician, and he's made algorithms out of my legal brain. But he also uses AI for that, and then with our mapping project. So AI is in the background of all of our work. But then even, you know, this is something that we're navigating in the Heirs Property Practitioner Network, and Sarah has also been very instrumental in, is like, what does it mean to use AI with actual client matters? And, you know, like I have one heirs property matter we're working on, and there must be 500 deeds. I don't know why there's so many deeds, but that's a lot of reading. And we actually need to know what all of the deeds say in order to put the puzzle back together. And so the question is, should we rely on AI to do that? Because it will actually make our work move faster, and it'll lower the cost for the client. But then, you know, we also have ethical duties, so.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I just say something that AI, and I'm thinking about history, like when Photoshop came out, I know like people are like, oh my God, graphic design is over, and then Photoshop becomes a tool, right? AI can be a great tool, but I can stop thinking about my clients who will still need me or an attorney to interpret some of that information, right? Needless to say that some of them don't even have a computer at home, so AI might be completely out of the question.
I do want to say for communities, and to the question of community preservation, there is a lot of opportunity to inform these machines. And so to the extent that communities collectively develop or put in the truth, so to speak, about their community and that history, that's really precious because it's building upon lots of other LML, whatever the terms are. So, yeah.
But I'm sorry, but I also wanted to say, not directly to AI, but in terms of education, I think the 70% or the other panels, there was a different number, but there's a large number of Americans who don't have any plans in place, any written estate plans. And a lot of times that's out of ignorance that they need one, or they don't know what they don't know. It's lack of education, lack of awareness. And so one of the things that we try to do through our 19 community branches around the country in generally underserved areas is provide a community, a place of community where people can gather and get that education. I think telling people or helping people to understand why it's important, like AI, I agree with Abraham, AI is gonna be a great tool, but you have to know that you need that tool. You need to understand why you might want to engage with that tool or with Giving Docs or with some other application or software or person before you get to how can AI help? Because I think just the awareness that's lacking is, from my perspective, the largest barrier to any of this.
You know, the one point I'd bring in, and similarly, not directly to AI, but in the space of data, that's important, I wanted to offer into the conversation is getting a snapshot of just how, just what the volume of heirs properties in a respective community is really a key element to getting ahead of the work and tactically approaching it. And, you know, there was a discussion we had earlier about the Pew study, and that informed work that happened in Detroit. And one of our partners in Birmingham has studied those and is using that as a model then to fully examine the real estate within the city of Birmingham to get that initial snapshot, right? And that moment of time of how many properties are or are likely, you know, in a tangled title situation. And then you can use that as a way of being well informed with your tools that you have at your disposal for outreach, for supporting those families, et cetera.
Thank you. We are at the end of our time, so this is going to have to be our last question, and this is going to be a lightning round, so think of a short answer to this one. But it's such a good question and really gets to the heart of what this discussion on this panel is about in terms of providing solutions that not only repair the damage of heirs property, but prevent heirs property and prevent that tangled title situation from happening in the first place. So the question is this: as we deal with rectifying the existing heirs properties, what are the solutions to stop this from being a continued cycle as new homeowners enter the market? And I'll start with Abraham.
Well, I can think of our first-time homebuyers program, who serves around 4,000 people per year, where we educate first-time or homebuyers to be. Some of the youngest people coming to the program are 20 years old. Think about buying a home at 20 years. Right, so anyway, one of the things that we are presenting to them is estate planning, right? Culturally, and I mentioned this to some of you, we need to be more comfortable talking about death. I mean, no one wants to think about death at 20 years old. No, I'm 40, I don't want to think about death, right? But unfortunately, it's a reality of life. It's like the yin and the yang. So we need to make sure, we need to change or contribute towards changing that culture around those conversations and presenting that information at the right time. You just bought a home. Hey, how about thinking about estate planning, right? It's a huge milestone. You're married, you're not married, maybe there's something that can happen or not happen to this property depending on where you are. You have kids, don't have kids. I mean, there are those critical moments where we could have those conversations. Sorry, it was a long.
That's okay. That's okay.
Darn, I forgot my answer. Just kidding. So one thing is similar to how in the 90s and the early 2000s, a lot of law firms offering planning services led trust-centered plannings. And so what I mean is using a trust instead of a will as the dominant strategy. They did that because the threshold for inheritance taxes was low enough that many Americans could actually be taxed when they die, or their estates would be taxed when they die. Well, many Americans can create heirs property, so we need, as practitioners, to look at having trust-centered models or entity-centered practices and change the thinking around what does it mean to how we own real estate. You know, you don't have to be rich or wealthy in terms of dollars to have a trust-centered plan or to have whatever. And you actually, even though you pay more money on the front end for those planning services, you actually save a whole lot, not just economic, but a whole lot on the other side of it.
I'll try and be brief as well. Building off of Abraham's observation, what I'd offer into the conversation is that honestly what I've learned myself is that there isn't a wrong time to talk about estate planning, to introduce that into the conversation. It may be an unfortunate time when, say, there's a natural disaster, right, as an example. But by and large, there isn't a wrong time. We actually were just learning about an organization called Catapult Pittsburgh. They've been partnering with a regional bank, and they're working on tying together when those new mortgages are made with estate planning. One of our partners that I mentioned earlier in Baltimore is doing something very similar, but at a later moment in that family's life. It's when they're going through a home repair program and taking advantage of that, introducing estate planning into the equation at that moment. So there's a variety of moments and no wrong time for it.
And I think that's right, to build on that as well. It's the education, and it's all of us who are aware of this issue and who know something about estate planning to not just tell clients, customers, people, but to train others to do that as well. So we have our bankers and our financial advisors and all the people who interact with the community taking any opportunity to build on that. Like, you're opening an account. Hey, you're taking that in your individual name. Have anybody talked to you about taking it in joint ownership or doing a pay on death designation, which can avoid probate, which is a very soft way of entering an estate planning conversation without saying estate planning or talking about wills or trusts. And I agree with everything Mavis said as well, but it's an entry to the conversation, and then you can build trust. I think it's a longer term process, but if it hasn't been obvious from my remarks, I think that education and getting people to understand why planning in general, and particularly planning around real property ownership, is so important is one of the keys.
And I'm the last one, right? I come from, Giving Ducks was kind of born out of a behavioral science lab, so we looked a lot at, like, how do you get someone to do something, and the first thing they told us was education is not very effective at all. Alone, education alone. Educating people and then getting them to do something around that, where there's some kind of practice involved, is super effective. And the most effective thing to get someone to do something right is to just legislate it and take the choice away from them. So uniform Heirs Property Act is a step in the right direction, but as we've seen, that's splintered. It's different in different jurisdictions. It's implemented wrong, so that's not a likely, holistic solution. So looking at how do we get in front of people, get them to understand this, like your suggestion, get them to think about the practicalities of it, not just reading about what happens, and not making it about death. We know if we want people to do anything estate planning related, it cannot be about death.
If I may, the elephant in the room, or maybe I don't know, there's an elephant in the room. The reason we have heirs property is our laws create it. Like, it's a naturally occurring form of ownership. And so we don't actually talk about the fact that state laws create this form of ownership, and they fall short of helping families co-manage after that transfer happens. So that could be another solution if states wanted to adopt some sort of model legislation to create a new legal bundle of rights. I feel like that would actually end it, but
that's the ideal
I'm not a policy
solution,
person.
but who's the financial stakeholder that's going to push for that? I don't know yet.
Exactly. I don't know that there's financial incentive to do it, actually. So, I mean, for the people there is, but for, yeah. There's a lot of opportunity, I would say, though.
And laws are famously slow to change.
Exactly, yeah.
But it is part of the solution, that legislative angle. Well, thank you all very much. Please join me in thanking all of our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now it is my great privilege to introduce our next speaker, who will be closing us out, Councilmember Tiffany D. Thomas of the City of Houston. Tiffany Thomas was reelected in 2024 and is a transformative public servant, visionary leader, and trusted coalition builder, serving as the first female Houston City Council member for District F, home to one of the most diverse populations in the city and state. Known for her bold leadership, people-centered approach, and fearless policy execution, Thomas is redefining what local government can do when driven by courage, clarity, and community trust. As chair of the Housing and Affordability Committee under 2 mayoral administrations, Thomas has been at the forefront of housing affordability and investment championing policy reforms and mobilizing millions in disaster recovery dollars for homeowners affected by Winter Storm Uri in 2021 and Houston's rent relief program, which gained national attention during the COVID-19 global pandemic in 2020. Her leadership ensured critical resources will directly support affordable housing and resilient communities across the city. Her signature initiatives include the inaugural Faith and Affordable Housing Summit, bridging the gap between faith institutions and development partners, and community education around heirs property, ensuring generational land retention in historically Black and Brown communities. Her commitment to dignified, place-based outreach is a model for city leaders nationwide. With a powerful ability to convene multiracial, multi-ethnic, and intergenerational coalitions, Thomas leads with both policy insight and cultural fluency. Her community meetings, summits, and public activations aren't just events, they're organizing moments that shape Houston's future. Beyond City Hall, she's a respected academic and assistant professor of community development at Prairie View A&M University, where she teaches graduate students and integrates research into her action. Her work has been published, cited, and replicated nationally, further cementing her role as a bridge between scholarship, policy, and grassroots leadership. Her record, reach, and results speak for themselves. Councilmember Thomas is not only shaping the city of Houston, she's shaping what leadership looks like for the next generation of public service. Join me in welcoming Tiffany Thomas. We're just going to give you the stage.
Good evening. I don't want to be between the closeout and the happy hour tonight, so I'm going to do my job and stay within my 15 minutes. That bio made me sound real busy. Like, who is that important lady? Good evening. I am so happy to be with you, and I appreciate the invitation. The panels were great. Can we give our panelists a round of applause? And our organizers for hosting us today. I am Tiffany D. Thomas. I have the pleasure of serving as a Houston City Council member. Clearly, I have many jobs because we don't pay public servants enough. Support your local public servants. But I really want to share, and my instructions tonight are to offer policy considerations and recommendations. And I think our panelists teased out a few possibilities for us to consider. And so from my work as a public servant and also a faculty member, this is something that I really lean in. And so for me, this work is deeply personal because it's not just political work, but I'm also an heir. I'm one of 15 identified heirs. My 4th great-grandfather fought in the Civil War, and a part of that exchange as the only Black platoon in Louisiana was land. Those acres still remain in our family in the St. James Parish of South Louisiana. No will, no estate. And I have a whole bunch of cousins, so we're not telling them we got land. We're just saying it's just us. So this work for me is personal. And so one of the things I know what was mentioned in my bio is that I teach at Prairie View. So I have to lead with this because this panel left us talking about the law. And what really created certain circumstances. So how many in the room are familiar with Special Order 15? Okay, we got 1 or 2 in here. Special Order 15 was issued January 16 of 1865 by William T. Sherman. And he went to meet with 20 Black ministers, 10 were Baptists, 10 were Methodists. And he said, well, what do you want? And they said, we want land. And at that time, the Southern planters had confiscated 400,000 acres of land from South Carolina all the way down to the Florida tip. We commonly call it 40 acres and a mule. That's Special Order 15. The mule came later. That was on loan by the U.S. Army. Most people don't know that piece either. But what also was simultaneously approved was the Freedmen's Bureau in March of 1865. And the Freedmen's Bureau was responsible for a lot of things, but it was also responsible for clearing title. The Freedmen Bureau closed in 1872. Right? So when we talk about the resistance of participating in wills and estate and land, we have to also acknowledge the complicated history with legal systems, banking systems, and how that cultural practice has transformed generation through generation through generation, and clearly exists in our lives. My brother and I are doing this with my father today, of asking him and forcing him to get serious about the house. Like, what do you want to do? And there is a resistance to that conversation. One of the things that I also do in terms of my course, I teach a cultural heritage and preservation course, and we start with Special Order 15. And my students get the benefit of exploring their land wealth through the course, right? We go through Ancestry, we do 23andMe, we look at land deeds, we look at former properties, and they have 15 weeks to do that. But the reality is many of the residents and the communities that we occupy in, they don't have space and time to take a class. They don't have that ability to do that, to research and understand their true story. So what we have an obligation to do is really inform policy that allows us to do a couple of things. One, it allows us to create a pathway to release and unlock the wealth for families and our communities. Number two, it allows us to address a potential housing shortage in the very community that they either live in or want to return to. And then also three, it allows us to formally address a cultural practice of land transfer. I want to side there because as chair of housing and affordability for the city of Houston, the fourth largest city, we are the hurricane disaster city, right? You want to know how to do that? Come to H-Town. Come to H-Town. We can show you some things on that. But I have a front row seat, and I remember it was MLK weekend of 2020. His name was Mr. Brown. He lived in District B. He came to, it was probably my second council meeting as a council member, and he came to public session and he said, Mr. Mayor, your housing department won't help me. I'm still impacted from Harvey. Now, we all remember Hurricane Harvey in 2017. It's the costliest storm on record. He says, I'm still living in my house with mold. So we were going through the paperwork and looking at the backup, and as someone who teaches cultural preservation, I said, oh, he doesn't have a clear title. He's an heir. And the former mayor at the time said, sir, you don't have a clear title. He says, well, you cash my taxes when I pay the taxes. He says, my uncle gave me that house. Everybody know my uncle gave me this house 25 years ago, right? And I was like, yes, because I know what my grandmother did with her house. This was a cultural practice. But the reality is because he did not have a clear title, when disaster strikes, he's not eligible for that funding. CDBG dollars, disaster recovery dollars do not account for the cultural practice of land transfer. So when we're looking at the neighborhoods that have low income, typically live in the floodplain that was mentioned, and just right now, just the climate collapse we're experiencing, California fires, St. Louis floods, North Carolina, Jersey, you name it. They do not qualify in Houston. The top two Black zip codes, districts B and D, had the highest number of declinations in terms of home repair. They didn't have a clear title, simply because the title, they could not benefit from their federal tax dollar finally returning back to them years later, which creates blight in our neighborhood, disruption, and creates a pathway for an escalated form of gentrification, not revitalization. So I see that front row. I can also share with you that as a member of the National League of Cities America Housing Comeback, that it's not unique to major cities like Houston. This is happening in small towns and villages and counties, and they're grappling with similar things, not just with residential urban land, but also agricultural land. USDA has acknowledged heirs properties from a low percent loan perspective. Even FEMA, after Hurricane Katrina, when they realized that there were so many people living in generational homes, but they couldn't qualify for the emergency assistance because they didn't have a light bill in their name. FEMA has learned that lesson, and now anyone who can provide a bill to an address can receive emergency assistance. But HUD is still the only federal agency that does not acknowledge heirs properties. I also think that in terms of what local cities all throughout our nation are grappling with is really looking at how we can identify this nationwide. The gentleman on the panel talked about an inventory, and I think it's really important that Baltimore is moving this way, but I think all cities must move in the direction of identifying what's in our inventory in terms of heirs property, because the reality is we don't have a uniform collection. One of the things that we are advocating for in Texas with 254 counties is uniform collection in the entire state, asking every county to make sure that we can document the number of heirs property and then also offer an heirs exemption, similar to a homestead exemption, that might have a clock to allow families to clear the title. And then their taxes may resume at a certain rate and pace over time. These are some of the policy recommendations that I think may also be helpful in your city, in your county, in your state as well. I also think that from a federal perspective, I know it was mentioned from the Heirs Act of 2024 that was introduced in the previous Congress, but that was uniquely for disaster recovery. But at the local level, many of the constituents that we serve, they can't qualify for the home repair program because they don't have the clear title. So what we've done is we've partnered with Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern. They received some private funding from a funder. So now, if we have voted to invest public dollars to protect the public asset, they have to identify 2 heirs moving forward. So we can protect the public asset, and the asset can also remain in the family. And I think that's a local recommendation. One, how many heirs properties are within your local city? What is your local government doing around that? And then how are they organizing? And I will also say, as an aside, a lot of times, if it's low-income communities, Black communities, there's this idea in the story that the government's not, they don't want to help us. The city doesn't want to help us. They don't want to revitalize our neighborhood. The neighborhood down the street gets everything and we get nothing. But I will tell you, as a council member that has worked to infill a remnant of a freedman town in my district, I was unable to move forward with building those homes because I couldn't get the signatures of the abutting properties because they didn't have an estate. And we were going to preserve that neighborhood, halt gentrification. We were on the track and we had to stop in our tracks. And so there are often times that government wants to be able to help, but we can't help because we don't have the policy in place. And so that's where your advocacy and our collective work together can advance. I also want to make an aside to the bipartisan Senate bill that came out 24-0, the Road Home bill. There's some language in there that allows flexibility for home repair for heirs properties for the affidavit. And I think that's a good practice. We're doing this in Houston already, but I also think it's a good practice for you all at the local level to consider for some affidavits and funding for that, either at your local, through your local budget, or also when you receive disaster recovery funds or your entitlement funds from HUD, your community development block grant dollars. When it's time for those HUD annual action plans, make sure that our voices and our comments, we're on public comments, we're on the record, we're at public session, because believe it or not, your elected officials don't know it all. And we really need the expertise at the table to inform us and guide us in the right way in order to do that, because you speaking up at public session may be the voice that pivots the funding, that allows us to clear titles or allows us to start a pilot program with HUD dollars in order to move some things forward. And so I know that my time is up, but I will tell you that there's so much more work for us to do. And the fact that all of us are in this room together on this shared issue tells us that it's important. This is the right direction that we need to go. But from every level of government, we must continue to do so. And Leslie, let me say this. Take advantage of your land grant institutions for research. Continue to work with them and your agriculture extension offices. FAMU does a tremendous job with their heirs property and their land research and their land outreach. Take advantage of them for research, op-eds, white papers, supported documents, so you can inform elected officials like myself to continue to do the great work that you do. Thank you so much. 8 o'clock, right on the dot. I did it.
Wow, what an evening. I want to thank everyone who, well, first I want to reintroduce myself. My name is Michael Neal. I am a senior fellow here at the Urban Institute in our Housing Finance Policy Center. With that out of the way, let me quickly just say I thought that was a terrific conversation. I want to thank all of you for coming out and participating. And Councilwoman Thomas, just thank you for the energy that you brought to this. There you are in the back there. Thank you so much for your comments. I thought they were a great call to action to end this conversation. So thank you for that. I want to just end really quickly just by extending thanks. I want to thank the JP Morgan Chase. I want to thank JP Morgan Chase for your support of this work, of the work that we were able to do, of the work that others were able to do. Just thank you so much for your commitment and for your courage on this issue. Number two, I want to thank people at the Urban Institute. I want to thank President Wartell, Sarah Wartell, for the way that she leads the Urban Institute, and issues around housing are near and dear to her heart. So we thank her for her leadership. Thanking Yannicka Radcliffe, who helped to open this conversation, who oversees our housing research. Thank you so much for everything that you've done in terms of supporting this work, being an advisor, and just being present as we thought through all of these issues. Thank you very much. And then most importantly, you see me at the front, but the people in the background who did all of the work, from our events staff to our research team. You don't see them, but they were the ones who really put this that really put this on, made sure that we got through prep sessions, made sure that we got people here, made sure that there was food, made sure even today the issue that we worked on and making sure the building actually stayed open. And JP Walsh, who's sitting in the back, he and I this morning were walking around with our building services team to make sure that the building was actually open so that people could leave. So thank you so much to that team. This would not have happened without you. And then finally, our audience. If you weren't here, we'd be talking to ourselves. Thank you so much. We tried something new. We tried an evening event. We tried something like what we used to call Sunset Series as a new way of approaching this. We thank you for being here. We thank you for engaging with us with your questions. We thank you for the people that are online that thought it not robbery to be here at this time of day. Just thank you. And with that, I hope that everyone gets home safely, and that the information that you received here today will inform your actions tomorrow.